Should we begin the relentless grilling of the
I think we
guest?
will. I think we'll be moving on to the interview, and we'll find out all about Shauna's approach to writing. So
Go on,
here we go.
we'll start it with the positive. Shauna, what is the first book you remember reading and enjoying?
Ooh. The first book see, when I was at school and I would have been about 7, I was told off for reading too much Enid Blyton.
What?
Yeah, because we had to keep a journal of all the books we read, and I read like a book a day. But I went through a phase of reading like all the Mallory Tower books, the O'Sullivan twins, Famous Five, Secret Seven, and The Faraway Tree, like all of her books. And the teacher like took me aside and was like, "Can you read somebody else?" So I know I read a lot of Enid Blyton, but I probably couldn't honestly tell you which ones I read first.
Mm.
Probably The Faraway Tree would have been the stories I probably read first.
So what about Enid Blyton's writing style and her storytelling? Sort of spoke to you at that stage, do you think?
Oh, well, I think I quite liked like the Famous Five and the Secret Seven, and also the Faraway Tree because it's adventure. And I was a real tomboy. You know, I had short hair, and I liked to go out and ride my bikes, and I wasn't very girly. And in the Famous Five, there was a tomboy called George,
Oh yeah.
as a dog called Timmy, and I very much thought that they were really cool, and I wanted to be like them.
Have you had any sort of difficulty coming to terms with the stuff that's been happening recently, with people sort of shelving the more sort of racist sentiments and stuff in the work of Enid Blyton? Because there were a couple that got taken out of circulation. I think, was it last year or the year before?
Yeah, I think that is happening, and you know what? I think it's right that it's happening. You know, I wasn't a fan of, say, the Naughty series, which is one of the series that came in for kind of criticism because of certain dolls that are in those stories, and I can completely see that. There's hundreds of thousands of children's stories, and I think you know, society has moved on since Enid Blyton was creating her stories, and I think we need to not ban stories, but just showcase stories that include everybody and kind of show a world, you know, that is fun and inclusive. And I think stories that are problematic, and you know, I think sometimes you need to understand, well, these were written 60, 70, 80 years ago, and society was just different. And so you don't have to hate the author, but you have to acknowledge that the stories just don't work today. You know, so I have no problem, you know, with books kind of being not printed anymore. There's hundreds of thousands of stories to choose from that are fine, you know.
And indeed other Enid Blyton stories to read. Yeah.
Of course. I mean, even when I was reading them, obviously some of the girls' names and the boys' names are hilarious. You know, there's lots of Dicks and Fannies running around in the Famous Five, and you know that doesn't work anymore either. But it's just, when I was 7, obviously I didn't see any of that. I just saw fun adventures and that I enjoyed. And then once I had sort of read kind of Enid Blyton, then I moved on to other authors. I'm trying to think who else I liked. I really liked Roald Dahl. I really liked Judy Blume. I just would have read absolutely anything that anybody put in front of me. You know, I was at the library and the bookshop constantly.
Yeah.
You know, like Point Horror and Goosebumps and the Babysitter Club. You know, I just read prolifically. You know, I read a book a day easily when I was younger. Oh, and The Animals of Farthingwood I really loved as well.
I was just going to say that idea of being told off by the teacher. I remember because I had a very similar experience, like early reading and enjoyment of reading, and there was a period because I lived in the absolute sticks in Cumbria in the north of England, and the local library was just not. It was barely there, in all honesty. So I was sort of having to buy them, and I remember being sort of like, getting pretty like firmly disciplined about buying too many books when I was about 10. Um, so yeah, I definitely related to that quite a lot. Sorry, Nick, I needed to get that one out. What was your point?
No, it's okay. I don't actually remember.
That's quite all right. But Enid Blyton, fun, and that story's for everyone's sentiment. Do you feel that that's carried? Is that sort of one of the sort of pillars of your writing when you're constructing your series?
Okay, so well, my story is historical fantasy.
Mhm.
So it is based in the 10th century in Ireland, and it is, even though there's fantastical elements, the history is correct. But I think whenever you're researching history, really, and you really do need to make sure it's correct. And I think a conversation that's been had in the writing community over the last probably 10 years, certainly, but maybe a little bit longer than that, is kind of challenging bias as to kind of where did the people come from in England or Ireland or in Europe at that time.
Sure.
And I think the default position sometimes historically has just been that everyone's white.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's not true.
Yeah.
It's certainly not true in the 10th century. There's huge monastic movements. So we have, the church goes from North Africa, into Constantinople, into Asia, and then all across Europe. So there is movement of people that way. There is also, obviously, the Vikings are in my story. And, there is a huge slave trade going on at that time, of which Dublin is a key market. And you do any sort of research into where the Vikings were and where they took people, that was all over the Mediterranean and Northern Africa as well, and all those trade routes are clear to see. So when I wrote my story, I really, and again, I'm challenging what people think about Ireland. And I think, again, if people have ever read or watched anything about Ireland, I think people think of the Irish famine, maybe. And
Yeah,
I think,
can see that. Yeah.
people think Ireland's a very poor country and deprived, but actually in the 10th century, it's not. In the 10th century, there's a lot of wealth in Ireland. And so I actually think that Ireland that I have described in my book is very accurate. Even though there's fantasy in it, I think it's more accurate than anything else I have read in that time period, because I have included men and women of colour who I think absolutely would be there. I think the story would be wrong if they weren't.
Yeah.
Because there's just so many reasons why people from other countries would be in Ireland at that time. And I also think showing Ireland as a kind of, it's a richer, wealthier country that is rife with war is really the issue. And I really wanted to show that. And, it is important. I think, I know a few years ago, I think the film might have been, it was either 1917 or Dunkirk. And I know in those movies there are Sikh men who are fighting in the army.
Right.
And I remember someone commenting on Twitter and saying, oh, well, that wasn't realistic. And, obviously then hundreds of thousands of people saying, of course, it's completely realistic.
Yeah.
There was people from India and Sikh men and black men and, men from all cultures, were fighting in these world wars. They're world wars. And I think it is Hollywood has sort of brainwashed people because of how the movie system was, and the studio system is that everybody was white.
Yeah.
And Europe isn't white. It just isn't. It's multicultural and has been, since the Romans, certainly, probably before. And I think when you're writing historical fiction and you want it to be a serious work, you need to really think about that and not have that kind of default setting that was acceptable kind of like 20, 30 years ago when nobody kind of thought about it too much. Times have moved on. We need to think about that when we write. And so in my story, obviously most of the characters are Irish, and they're royal family members, and their ancestry can be recorded for generations upon generations, but that's not every character. And so I hope when people read my story, they will see that I have tried to make Ireland be as accurate as possible.
That is a fantastic answer. Thank you so much for that. That was such a fascinating insight into the way that you've approached writing that, because this is something that's actually really close to my heart generally, because I've been reading historical fiction since I was a child. And, I've loved Bernard Cornwell and Conigleden and all, Hilary Mantel, all that stuff. And it feels like you almost, with the help of adding fantasy to the historical fiction side of things, you can create a more accurate picture as well. Is that sort of giving you more space by playing with genre?
I don't know. I think actually, if I had just gone for a straightforward historical fiction novel, I would have done it the same, in terms of the people. I'm actually worried sometimes that because it's fantasy that people will think about that less. But certainly, some of the characters are mythological people, and so there's like several main characters, and one of the main warriors is called Coleman, and he is black. And his sort of backstory is that his grandfather decided to travel the world and kind of married an African princess, and there's other characters that are also going to be mixed race, because the Tuatha Dé Danann, who can live for hundreds and hundreds of years, sure, they would travel everywhere. You wouldn't just stay in Ireland. And so there's maybe more flexibility that way. But they're the mythological characters. The historical characters are also accurately portrayed, I think, and kind of reflecting what I think would be the real movement of people during the 10th century.
That's very exciting. That's very cool.
On the that idea of how Hollywood has kind of altered global perception of things, there's a fantastic micro example of it, which is that anywhere you go in the English-speaking world, people say that frogs go ribbit. There are no frogs in the United Kingdom or Europe or Ireland that go ribbit. The frogs that go ribbit are from California. And when they started recording the first lot of Foley for talking pictures, they recorded those frogs, and that became the frog noise. And so if something as simple as that, if we are teaching our children that an animal makes a noise because Hollywood told us, you can absolutely guarantee that what you're saying is true.
Yeah, I think it's just, it's what you see, and you can't help but sort of, I suppose, pick up on that, and it kind of goes into your brain, and you don't question it, especially if you see things when you're young. You don't have that kind of questioning mind yet. But no, I mean, it's certainly an issue. And even if you were to look at like a BBC production of a Charles Dickens novel, which is, say, they're set, in the 18th century?
Yeah.
And like absolutely everybody from the lead character to the extras in the background, and everybody traditionally in those kind of big dramas that used to be on, everybody's white. And again, like in the 18th century, that's just not possible. And I think recently, I think we've been seeing some good movies, and that's being challenged, and we're seeing better representation and more accurate representation. And I think that's really important. And when I was growing up in Northern Ireland, obviously because of the Troubles, like nobody ever wanted to come here. It really was fairly white. And now it's not, because the Troubles are over, and Northern Ireland and Belfast have jobs and economy is going, and so now Northern Ireland is quite mixed, and that's wonderful. And I would really like people from all over Ireland, from all different backgrounds, to read my book and maybe possibly see a character that's a bit like themselves, or to kind of feel that old Ireland isn't distant for them.
That potentially leads us quite neatly on to our next question, because the next question is, what gives you satisfaction whilst you're actually writing? Do you have a moment just to ask a follow-up question before you've even answered, do you have a moment when you create a character like that and you feel like you accurately portray someone who would have been there and would have spoken like that, and that the lives that they would have had, that you feel like you are opening an avenue for somebody to access your work that perhaps previously wouldn't have been able to access historical fiction like that?
I don't. I think that's an effect that I would like, but it's not. I suppose something I think too much about when writing, other than accuracy, is very important to me.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. And I think, you know what? Historical fiction has changed, I think, in the last 10 years, and we are seeing historical fiction and historical fantasy, that's set in Africa, that's set in like Vietnam, that's set in Japan, that's set in China. And I think, in like own voices, writers are beginning to like tell their stories of the culture, mythologies from where they're from. And it's really, really interesting. So I just sort of think when you're writing about history, challenging bias is really, really important, because you really, especially because I'm writing about Ireland, and it's not done very often, like especially in this century. And so I really actually felt a bit of a duty to do it correctly and to not get it wrong, because there's not a lot of other books for people to bounce off.
Yeah.
Whereas, say, if you're reading like a Hilary Mantel book about the Wolf Hall, you also could read a Philippa Gregory book. You could also read there's like Tudor stories are everywhere. So if one of them hasn't quite got it right, don't worry. There's 10 other authors that you can literally buy immediately from Waterstones or Amazon or wherever, and that might be right. But with Irish history, I just couldn't find it myself. And so the satisfaction probably then came to me where I felt, fantasy aside, I think the Ireland that I'm giving you and the historical characters that are there, I think I'm telling you a truthful story.
It's fascinating, because I'm just going back and re-examining, like, for example, the the Saxon series by Bernard Cornwell that got turned into The Last Kingdom. Yeah. Basically, throughout those books, I think he goes to Ireland once.
Yes, he does.
And it's for like a bit of one of the book, and he does something bonkers with a ship on a waterfall or something, and then they're gone again, and then the rest of the like discussions around like the sort of what's happening in Ireland in those books, it's just the Skraelings are fighting each other and they've killed another Viking. He really doesn't go into it, unfortunately, because it would be fascinating to see more of it. So I'm glad you've done it.
It's a good thing someone's doing it.
Yeah.
Well, that's actually very interesting. So I'm writing my third book at the minute, and what is fascinating at this time in Irish history is that English Viking invasions are also very relevant, and that characters who are invading England are linked to the people in Ireland, and so you can't have it as it's a distinct setting to England and Scotland. It isn't. People here are related to people in all those places, and so it's actually Ireland and England and Wales and Scotland. They're so close, geographically. So it makes sense that they shouldn't. Well, at that stage, they were not treated as these distinct countries and entities. The Vikings were coming down and they all wanted lands, and any land would do.
Yeah, and it turns out they're really good on boats, so they can totally get across the Irish Sea. Yeah.
So that I've had some very fun scenes in my second book about the boats.
Fantastic.
Kind of talking about why they were so good, and why they worked on sea and river, and why that was so important to their ability to trade and to conquer and all of that. So yeah, the boats are key.
Well, it sounds like I'm ordering your books after we finish after we finish recording.
So you say you're working on book 2. Well, no, you finished book 2. You're working on book 3, rather.
Mhm.
What is your writing process?
Right. So I don't plan very much. And if this wasn't historical fantasy, I probably wouldn't plan at all. I have a timeline because I know kind of what has to happen at different stages. And like I'm a big reader of Irish history. So the timeline, I kind of know it, if you know what I mean. It's not something I have learnt for this book. It's history I already know.
Yeah.
So that is my plan, I suppose. In my head is I have the timeline and then I just write. And I think at this stage the characters of Fola and Gormla are very, very stuck in my mind. So I know something has to happen and then they just start speaking and I just write.
Love that. Just a proper flow of consciousness, except it's 2 other consciousnesses that you've had to wrangle into place. That's
It is. It's funny actually because I remember years ago, George R. Martin was talking about Tyrion and saying that Tyrion was far wittier than what he was. And at the time, I thought, well, sure, how can that be? Because you're writing the things that Tyrion says. You know, it's your wit, surely. But as I'm writing my 2 characters, Gormla in particular is wild. Like she does things that are absolutely crazy. And when I'm writing, sometimes I'm like, I can't believe you're doing that. Why are you doing this? So she shocks me, and I sort of get it now that sometimes characters just take on. They feel like a real person that does things that you would never do yourself or think of yourself, but somehow being in their head makes you think of these things.
Oh, that's really heartwarming. I like that.
Aside from the deadline, the looming deadline, how do you know when the book you're writing is done? How do you know you've finished?
So I always know the end, if that makes sense. So I know, but actually in saying that, my first book, The Children of Gods and Fighting Men, whenever that got accepted, Head of Zeus asked me to write 2 extra chapters at the end because they thought it finished too quickly. So maybe I'm not a great judge of where a book should end.
Did you say no?
No, I did. I wrote the extra 2 chapters. Not actually to add much plot, actually, but just to kind of be in the heads of the characters a little bit longer before kind of the ending happened, and I suppose a period of transition would happen between book 1 and book 2. So yeah, but for book 2 and for book 3, I had very definite endings in my head, and so far that seems to be working.
Fantastic. Whilst you're writing, do you listen to music at all?
So in my first drafts, yes, but I can only really listen to soundtrack music. I find lyrics really distracting because I start to listen to the words and then I can't write. So soundtrack, yes, and I would sort of pick my soundtracks to match the mood I want to capture.
Right.
So if I'm writing a battle scene, I'll put like the Gladiator soundtrack on.
That is such a good soundtrack, though, isn't it?
So good.
So good.
Or I really like the Witcher season 1 soundtrack. I listen to that quite a lot.
What's it called? There's 2 tracks on it. One is
Silver is for monsters, steel is for men.
That's the one. Yes, those are great.
Yeah.
Those are very good for writing fight scenes too.
Absolutely mad vocal.
Yeah, it's like an undulating whale, right?
Yeah. So I find it's quite it's got good vibes anyway. It's quite eerie as well in places in the soundtrack. The Great Cleansing is my favorite soundtrack on the favorite track on the Witcher soundtrack. I love that one.
I'll have to I think I'll have to add that to my playlist. Any other recommendations that we can mine you for?
Well, obviously I listened to like all the Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon, and I really loved Wheel of Time soundtrack as well. I thought that was fabulous. I listened to the Tudors soundtrack. Which did you ever watch that?
I did. Yeah, that was with the Welsh actor as playing Henry, right?
No, he's Irish.
Oh, he's Irish. Sorry, that's my bad. It's just because he's Rhys Mears, isn't he? I think.
Yes, that's correct.
Yes, sorry.
That's a really good soundtrack to listen to. Yeah, so
I'd
just
genuinely forgotten that show happened until you just brought it up.
Yeah.
No, I loved that show. It was very, very good. Actually, I remember being in a really bad mood after watching the episode when Andelin died. Spoiler.
It was.
Did you not
Spoiled.
know?
Oh wow, yeah. It was sort of like a proto. It was sort of a proto Game of Thrones, wasn't it? Because it was fairly sort of risque in the stuff that it was showing, and
Yeah.
it was on primetime British television and stuff. Yeah, no, it was quite. Yeah, I have fond memories of it. I don't know whether it would hold up to a rewatch now, but it was.
I don't know. I haven't seen it in years. I've seen it when it was on the TV. But yes, it was. It was very I suppose scandalous and sexy. And I remember at the time, can't remember who it was, but somebody thought it was going too far. And I was like, well, but it's depicting a time when, a man's having like all these affairs and killing his wives.
Yeah, he started his own church.
Yeah. Yeah, so it felt probably a bit more accurate than some of the kind of stuffier productions that maybe had been on before about the Tudors. But anyway, it has a very good soundtrack, so you don't have to watch it. You can just listen to that. It's very good.
Yeah, very good.
So that's my first drafts when I'm still writing, and then when I'm editing, I can't listen to any music. I just find it too distracting. And then I'm trying to what I often read out loud what I've written.
Yes.
Especially for this book, because the characters are Irish. And whenever I wrote it, I didn't want it to be over the top. In terms, sometimes when people write Irish people, we can sound like pirates or Yoda, or it's like too exaggerated.
Pirates or Yoda, you should put on a shirt. That's great.
Yeah, I know. It's like Yoda pirates. That's what we sound like sometimes.
You should have it as a sliding scale with the Irish accent at one end. It sort of slides up through pirate to Yoda.
Yeah.
Become force sensitive in the middle somewhere.
Yeah, so I'm trying not. I don't think I would do that, but I also want it to have like an Irish style of phrasing.
Yeah.
And I think when you read it out loud, then you can tell if it's natural or not. And so when I'm reading out loud, obviously there can be no music. I just have to sort of listen to the rhythm of the words.
I completely agree with all that. That's exactly what I do as well when I'm writing. But it's very heartening to hear that there's somebody else that does that as well. I think Nick, you do a lot of reading the stories out loud as well to check them, don't you?
Yeah.
I was explaining this to someone earlier about writing books because Nick and I are both in the process of creating our first books, and when you've read your own novel like 20 times, because you've got to read it in order to edit it, there does come a point where you become like kind of bored of it occasionally. Like if you're just reading the same bit over and over again with like small changes.
Mm-hmm.
Do you ever find that? Are you just like, I am done with this chapter now? Have to move on.
I felt like that with my first 3 chapters of my first book, because obviously, the submission process, and you're constantly trying to tweak the first 3 chapters to catch an agent's eye. So I find the first 3 chapters really difficult to read, just because I like 20 is like, I feel like it's 200 times I've read those 3 chapters. Yeah. So, but no, aside from that, and generally, when I edit, I try not to labour on any one chapter too long, and then come back to a week later, because you go word blind. You can't see any typos or errors anymore because you're reading what you expect to be there, not what is actually there. So, when I'm editing at the end, I just read the book over and over. So you're reading chronological order. And then by the time you go back to start, then your head is clearer and you can read it properly.
Just on the sort of trying to catch an agent's eye thing, so how was that process for you? Did it take a while? Was it fairly quick?
It took a wee while. My previous book was just rejected. It never went anywhere. And so when I started submitting this book, COVID had just started. And I sent it off, and I think it was probably bad timing. I think lots of books got delayed being printed, and a lot of agents weren't open.
Yeah.
So I sent it off, and I got one fill request. That didn't work out. And then I think winter, I sent it off again, and then I had a few more fill requests. That didn't kind of go anywhere. And then I was really sort of thinking about maybe I'd self-publish and researching editors. And I just thought, well, this was now April, May time. And I thought, well, you know what? I'll send it off one more time. Lots of the agents that had been closed were now reopened. And Head of Zeus had an open submission window as well. And I thought, you know what? There's 6 agents here who were like my favourite agents that had been closed. They're now open. I'm going to send to them, and I'm going to send to Head of Zeus. And that's sort of my last go at sending the book out. And then it went kind of mad because Head of Zeus made an offer to publish it without an agent. But then at the same week, I had 4 agents who also... 3 agents who made offers to represent me as well, and they had all requested the fills before I had the offer from Head of Zeus, so I sort of felt they were interested kind of before the offer had come in.
Yeah.
So that happened really quickly. That all happened in the space of like 2 to 3 weeks.
Could you explain the difference between going with those 2 different kinds of offers, just so we fully get that?
Okay, so Head of Zeus, they made an offer, so it's their standard offer. And because Head of Zeus is a fairly newish publisher, I think they've been going for about 10 to 15 years. So they do have unagented authors on their books, especially the authors that maybe joined with them kind of at the start. So they have a standard contract that they would offer anybody who signed with them. However, because I'd had interest from the agents, I said to them, look, do you know what? I think I'd prefer an agent. Publishing, I don't know anything about this business. I don't know the first thing about it. And I would just feel better if I had an agent to kind of look over the contracts. And not only this contract, but, you kind of want an agent to support your entire career and to get new contracts for you. This is a 3-book deal, but there's more books I want to write. You need an agent. So they said, yes, of course, just take a couple of weeks and, kind of sift through the agents that have made you offers. And once you've chose one, then kind of we'll be in contact with them. And so I got an agent, and he was able to improve the contract.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Very good. So you had to sort of, was there a bit of sort of nail biting where you were like, I need to be patient here, but it's difficult to be patient because I just want to snap this offer off the table, sort of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. A little bit, if I'd had no agents interested, I would have signed the contract the next day. And it was a good contract. There wasn't anything wrong with the contract. And I would have happily signed it. But obviously agents are there, and they're there to get you a better deal. And my agent's very good. And so he loved the story. So he was like, this story is going to go do really well. I can really feel it. And you've obviously seen it too. It's, and so he was sort of singing my praises and was able just to improve the contract.
That is fascinating. Thank you so much for that insight. That's really cool to sort of see inside that bit of happening. It's really appreciated.
You've inside baseballed this poor author more than enough, Ben.
Sorry.
We're going to do some of the fun questions.
Yeah.
Say the fun ones, the hard ones sometimes. What is, top of your head, your favourite novel?
Ooh, Anna Karenina.
Ooh. What draws you to Karenina?
It is the best written book I think I've ever read. I think Tolstoy, War and Peace is obviously a good book too. I just think probably the like characterization Tolstoy just really gets right, and it's obviously such a tragic story, and it's really a critique of society that still feels very fresh, even though the story is over 100 years old. And I found it, and I think I read it the first time maybe when I was about 19, 20, and it still just really stayed with me.
Yeah. So
It's wonderful.
I'm often accused of being less intellectual, but did you ever read Android Karenina?
No. No, I didn't.
It's it's they did that whole run of Sensibility and Sea Monsters and Pride and Prejudice and Zombies.
Yes, I
Android
did read Pride
Karenina
and
was the
Prejudice
one
and
that really
Zombies.
jumped out at me.
When
Yeah.
you say you get accused of not being intellectual, do you mean you accuse yourself repeatedly?
I know.
No, you have no idea what people say to me, Ben.
That's true.
It's
That's
nice
true.
of that smart man to take care of you
I just
on his evenings off.
just wanted to make it clear that it's not me bullying you off mic.
You're lucky I let you speak, boy.
Fantastic. Oh wow, Leo Tolstoy. So, does it matter to you that it's a translation? You feel like the writing transcends that?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I obviously I didn't speak Russian, so I can't compare.
Yeah.
But I found that it was it worked, and then also like one of my other favorite books is The Count of Monte Cristo, which is also a translation, and is fantastic. And I think just some stories and some characters just work, and that's when the characterization has been done well, because characters should work irrelevant of what nationality they are and what language they speak. And so, so whenever you have a good writer like Dumas and Tolstoy, they obviously are able to really capture the characters that they've created.
Considering
people everywhere.
Exactly. I mean, considering they keep on trying to make a successful Three Musketeers movie, it must there is an enduring element to Dumas' characters, definitely, as well.
Well, yes, because I was so excited when the movie of The Count of Monte Cristo came out, and he's in that. Guy Pearce is in it. I can't remember who else, but and Richard Harris, he is in it, and he is incredible. And the first half of the movie is amazing, and it like follows the book, and then the second half obviously just cannot do the story in an hour, because it's such a long book. And I think in this age of TV, I'm like, why has somebody not adapted that? That's crying out for like a 8 or 10 episode dramatization, because you could actually do the story properly.
Well,
I think
you've just said that, we do have a question, which is, if you could adapt any book into another medium, what would it be? To which medium and why? Is it that?
Yeah. It's been in my head for years. Like, why has there not been like a big like HBO or BBC, drama? Like you could, because the Hollywood stars do TV now, so you could get some amazing actors to play those parts.
Have a fantasy cast?
Also, oh gosh, I don't know. It's too much pressure. I can't cast it.
Yeah, that's okay. Don't worry about it.
It's okay. You get off way with it.
But in like a sort of like a HBO style, that kind of like hour-long, lots of budget, lots of sex, lots of violence kind of adaptations.
Yeah. Something a bit like House of the Dragon, or it's not that it's hugely violent, but I would even go for like a BBC adaptation that's fairly tame and mainstream, because I just think the story is so good. It's like the ultimate story of revenge, and most of it's non-violent revenge. Most of it's just absolutely destroying people's lives, and I just think TV would just be the perfect medium.
There's something so strange about the phrase "previously on the Count of Monte Cristo," isn't there? It feels weird in the mind.
Yeah.
Think about that. All the things that previously been on Unique.
Well, the Count of Monte Cristo for one. Quite the chap he was.
Very good. Very good. Well, so very importantly, where is the best place for people to buy The Children of Gods and Fighting Men?
Amazon, obviously, but
Yeah.
obviously also Waterstones. The Broken Binding have signed copies on sale at the minute, which is there. If you're in Ireland, there's Dubray Books and Eason's, and in America there is Barnes and Noble. But really, anywhere that sells books, you should be able to order my book if it's not there.
Fantastic. And the next book, what's the title of the next book? Sorry.
Book 2 is called The Words of Kings and Prophets.
Oh, that's a good title.
These are great titles. It's one of the first when I saw the title of your book. It was one of the reasons, one of the many reasons why we reached out to you, because I thought that is a fantastic. I feel like we're going to get on just from the title of your book.
Here is actually the funny thing. So when I did my first 2 submission rounds, it had a different title.
Okay, you allowed to tell us what it is?
It was just Gormla, because he's one of the characters in the books, and because I couldn't think of a title, and when I changed it to The Children of Gods and Fighting Men, that's when everybody was interested. So a good title could be important.
That is a good tip. And where can people sort of keep up to date with news about you? Should they go to your website? Should they go to your Twitter account? Where's the best place?
Yes, so Twitter and my websites and my newsletter are kind of the best places. I do a monthly newsletter, and I kind of collate any podcasts I've been on or anyone that's reviewed my book. I'll put in their YouTube video or podcast links, and then I also talk about what I'm reading, how my writing's going. So the newsletter, I think's pretty cool.
Sounds like a good place. Yeah.
But aside from that, I'm fairly active on Twitter as well.
Excellent. Well, we'll be adding you on there so people can follow it. But what is your Twitter handle, just in case they don't see the post?
Oh, it is Shauna L. Writes.
Shauna L. Writes.
Yeah.
Shauna, I must say you've been a fantastic guest.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. You've really given me some stuff to think about with the way that you are very firmly opening your writing to everybody. I think that means a lot, and it will mean a lot to a lot of people who enjoy reading these kinds of genres. So I'm glad that you're doing what you're doing, and what you're doing is really cool anyway. So well done.
Thank you.
And thank you for your time. It's been phenomenal to hear your story and to chat just generally about books with you. So thank you.
Oh, well, no, thank you for inviting me. It's always lovely to chat about books and writing. I could talk literally all night.
Welcome back anytime.
Oh, thank you.
We mean it.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of The Tiny Bookcase.
Remember to subscribe, otherwise you're going to miss out on the future fun.
Also, tell a friend. If you like this episode, link them to it.
We'd be tremendously grateful. You can follow us on Twitter at BookcaseTiny, Facebook at The Tiny Bookcase, and Instagram at BookcaseTiny for updates. Speaking of supporting the podcast, well, magic can only take one so far. The Tiny Bookcase is supported by the generosity of its patrons. Those kind souls have really kept my belly full the last year. Let's cast a spell for them, shall we? For magnificent beardery, let's cast the Chinicus folliculale spell on Gary Laird. For rich ginger tones on the scalp, let us cast the Orangi Hedondo spell for Scott Byrne. And for general fabulousness, why not the Ooh La La, How's Your Mother spell on Matthew McLaren?
How do you come up with that shit, man?